And this is one, so the mechanical properties of the stem are the main feature. A second very important thing is the connection between the crown and the leaves and the roots to transport water and nutrients. So water is taken up by the roots and then conducted via the cells in the stem up into the ground. And the third thing in the wood is very important, and this is the storage of nutrients, because a tree, at least in Europe, for example, has to survive the not very favorable winter season, and in spring it has to grow new leaves, and for this action it needs storage nutrients. And third part is the crown, which consists of the branches, the twigs, and fixed to them are the leaves, the flowers, and later on the fruits or seeds. So to produce energy, the crown is very important, and also to keep a species alive. I said the tree usually starts to grow from the ground. There are some trees which do it the other way around. So for example, this banyan fig starts growing in the crown of another tree, and from there roots are going down to the earth and form a layer around the supporting tree. And this layer kills the supporting tree, but in the end it is strong enough to support the own plant and to keep the crown up to the light. There are, of course, as everywhere, some maxima and minima. The highest tree, the measured highest tree, is an eucalyptus, which is 155 meters high. One of the most thickest trees is a cypress in Mexico with a diameter of 14 meters. The smallest trees are herbaceous meadows growing in the alpine region. And as this area is not very favorable from the climatic situation, these trees grow underneath the surface. So it's a creeping stem, and only somewhere side branches come out of the ground and hold the leaves and the flowers and fruits. Then, of course, the oldest tree, we don't know whether this is really the oldest tree. It's the oldest tree where it was possible to count the rings exactly. So this was a Pinus longeva, a bristlecone pine living in the White Mountains in California, and a geologist wanted to extract cores from this tree, but unfortunately the cores broke, and so he was allowed, exceptionally, to cut down this tree, and then it was possible to count the rings. As you can see here on the stump, the situation is very irregular, and this is why it was from the beginning a miscalculation to try to drill a core from this. But you can't tell in the forehand sometimes. This is another old tree, again from California, and this was counted from cores, but it is not very exactly, but it seems to be much older than the other one. The problem with these trees is that some of them have so-called missing rings, which means the ring is not missing entirely, but it is not grown on all the circumference of the stem. So if you drill from a side where it is not present, then of course you can't count it. These were trees which with their body had this enormous age. Another possibility, of course, is that the DNA survives by continuous growth of branches and new parts of the plant. So this clone of an oak in California from DNA investigations is approximately 13,000 years old, but obviously not the tissue which is present here has this age, but the DNA. So 13,000 years ago, the plant was growing with exactly the same DNA constellation as today. Now, the definition of wood. Wood is a tissue which is found in the roots, the stems, and the branches and twigs of trees and bushes. The difference between tree and bush is that a tree has a stem, whereas a bush starts the branches at the ground level. So the stem is missing. Wood is grown by dividing cells of a layer which is called cambium and which covers the wood cylinder. We will see this later on. And these cells in the beginning are tiny and have a very thin cell walls. And by the time they grow and form their final shape, and in the end, there is lignin inserted into the wall material. After this, the cells are dying. The inside of the cell is transported to other places where the basic materials are needed again. And the remain is a very tiny pipe. And these tiny pipes are used for the water supply I have mentioned before. And of course, by the help of the lignin, which strengthens the cell walls, it helps to produce the mechanical strength of the stem. Here you can see the stump of trees, respectively a disc here, and you can see concentric layers. And these layers are the thickening growth which happens each year. So each year the tree has to produce another layer on the outer circumference of the stem. And by this operation, it becomes thicker and thicker. Usually it has one center, which is called pith. In this case, the branch divided very low near the roots, and we have two centers, which of course, more above the ground, will have two parts of the stem. Yeah, and one other remark, these layers are only visible in areas with temperate climates with winter season. So this winter season stops this thickening growth. And this is why a sharp border is produced between two layers. And this sharp border divides one tree ring from the next. In tropical areas, of course, the trees have to grow into the thickness as well, but there is no winter dividing one growth layer from another. And you can't tell which part of the tissue has been growing this year or last year or any other year. So dendrochronology, which we will deal with next lecture, it depends on this winter interruption of growth. Now let's have a look to the several groups of plants. There are, first of all, the monocotyl angiospermae, which are subsumized from the trees, under the palm trees. There are also some herbaceous members, and all of them have only so-called primary thickening. What does it mean? These trees don't produce rings or layers, but they have single aisles, so to say, of growth. Here you can see a magnification. This is the herbaceous corn plant, which also belongs, like all other grasses, to this group of plants. And in such an area, you have bigger vessels for the conduction of liquids, and you have an area with cells with thicker walls, which strengthen the tissue. But such an area has only a very limited growth. It is this part, which is this so-called cambium, and by dividing its cells, it also produces to both directions new cells, but only for a certain period of time. Afterwards, this tissue stops dividing and the area is complete. It can't change anymore. To produce new such areas, they have to start from the very outside of the stem. So here you can see there are some small areas which just started growing. All the inside ones have already finished. And this is a surface picture of a palm tree. And again, you can see these areas of growth with the big pipes for conducting water, and the area with thick-walled cells for strength property. Let's switch to the next group, which are the conifers. They are a member of the gymnospermae and are also called naked seed plants. These plants have a very limited primary and a very important secondary growth. And this means here you have the cross section of the twig of a pine tree. And this is 1 year old. And here in this area, you have the cambium, which by dividing cells produces to the inside the wood cells, and outside also cells are separated. And after some years, you can see the different layers of this thickening growth. Again, here you will have the cambium. And you can see an important fact. The cells in the beginning of the tree ring have a wide inside hole and thin layers, whereas the cells in the outer part of the tree ring have small holes and thick cell walls. So there is a separation of, let's say, work to be done. The cells in the first part of the tree ring are conducting water. The cells in the outer part of the tree ring are producing the mechanical strength. And this is a sketch of a part of some gymnosperm wood. Here you have the ring border. To this area, the new wood started growing with cells with big holes, which start becoming smaller and smaller until at the end of the year, they are very small and have thick cell walls. And here again, we have another ring border. We have also some radial cells, which are called rays, and these consist of living cells. So most of the cells in this area are dead, otherwise it wouldn't be possible to conduct water, whereas the ray cells are living, at least in the outer part of the wood, and they are used for storage. And the third big group of plants are the hardwoods or leaf trees. There are a big number of herbaceous members which only have primary thickening again. And another part of this family of plants has lignified cell walls and not only primary but also secondary thickening, and these are the trees and bushes, of course. Here are some members of the herbaceous plants. I won't stress any details. You can see there are also these areas of growth. And here we have a first switch to secondary growth. Primary growth is only inside these areas. And when the cambia in these areas stop their activity, there is a continuous layer produced, again cambium, and this layer originates the secondary growth. So there is a continuous layer of wood then in these plants. In elder, you have a very big pith, which is the inner part of the stem. And here you have these areas of primary growth, and the orange part, this is artificially colored, of course, the orange part of the wood is the result of secondary growth. And again, we have starting from the pith, layer by layer, the twig and the branch and the stem becomes thicker and thicker as one layer after the other is grown year by year. The big difference to the softwoods is that we have very large vessels, which are cells with a very big diameter. And another difference to the softwood is the connection between one and the next of these vessel cells. In the softwoods, there are only small so-called pits where liquid can penetrate from one cell to the next one. And here we have big areas of either completely dissolved cell wall material, or the material is broken by slits or by holes. So the main difference in the body of the plants, if you look at the conifers, this of course is an example of, or an exception, because the larch is putting away its needles in autumn and starts regrowing them in spring, as most of the other softwood members are evergreen. The contrary is with hardwood. There are only few members with evergreen leaves, uxus and others, and most of them, at least in our climate, are leaving their leaves and regrowing them in spring. The basic difference is the stem, which is monopodial at the softwoods, so it has one, so to say, starting point and growth in length each year, and year by year side branches are occurring which then form the crown. So it's a very symmetrical body of the tree, whereas the hardwood, very low in the stem, produces branches, and they again produce side branches and so on. So the shape of the crown is much more diverse and irregular than it is with the softwood. If we have a look to the basic structure of wood, so again we have the ring borders, one layer, next layer, and so on. The red layer is the cambium, which produces by dividing cells to the inside, which form the wood, and to the outside, which form the bast or bark outside. And the green structures are the rays I have talked about before. So we have a axial structures which connect the roots with the crown, and we have radial structures which connect the outer parts of the stem with the inner parts. To be able to look at the anatomical features, we need to have very specified areas where to look at the cells. So we have three main sections. One is the horizontal or square section, which is rectangular to the axis of the stem. You can see the tree rings and you can see the rays. Then we have a tangential section, which is parallel to the axis of the tree, but outside of the pith. And here you can see the rays, but the rings are, at least here, they are not very visible anyway. And we have the radial section. Here we have the rays, which are not marked here. And of course, we have again the ring borders, as you can see. So here again, the three main sections: the square section, the tangential section, and the radial section. And as the structure of wood is a quite complicated three-dimensional thing, you may understand why it is necessary to have defined sections, because if you do some sections somehow in this structure, then of course you will see something, but this will be a distorted picture. And if I do it somehow different, then we will see different things. We can't discuss the results. So it is necessary to use these three sections. I have said that only a few cells in the stem or in the body of a tree or bush are living. The only tissue or the only part, the only layer of the stem which consists only of living cells is the cambium. The bast outside and the sapwood, which is the outer part of the wood cylinder, they consist mainly of dead wood, but include some living cells, which are mainly the rays. And then we have the bark and the so-called hardwood. And these parts are consisting only of dead cells. So you can imagine a body of a tree, let's say, consists mainly of dead cells, although it is living. And the reason for this is that we have the necessity of bringing water from the roots up to the crown and the leaves. So in the contrary to animals, which if their body contains dead cells, they are in danger to die. If a tree contains dead cells, it is necessary for his survival. Now let's have a look at the wood, a closer look. So first of all, we need to get a proper surface. And the easiest way is either with fresh wood, or if it is a wood from storage, you need to soak it with water for some minutes. And then you take a razor blade and cut the surface. This is a certain technique. It's necessary to train it, but it's possible to learn it anyway. you only should take care of your fingers, because these razor blades have very sharp edges, and it is easily be done if you not only cut the wood, but also your fingers. Why cutting and not grinding? If you grind the surface of wood, you produce wood powder. And this wood powder is then penetrating the cells and filling their holes. So in the end, you get a surface without any optical contrast, and you can't see any details. So the only way is to cut it with the razor blade. And then you may use lenses. There are different sorts, of course, and you can have a look at the structure of the wood. Here you have the surface, the magnified surface of an oak. You can see the rings. You can see the dark inner part, which is the hardwood. You can see the lighter outer side of the stem, which is the sapwood. And here we should have the cambium, again the bast, and then the bark. The radial structures are the rays. You can see some features even with the magnification of a lens. For example, you can see that the pith is has 5 lobes, and this is one of the special features an oak wood is different from other trees. Here we have the square surface of hornbeam, Carpinus betulus, and here we have a different picture. Again, we can see concentric zones, but with this magnification, we can't, in many cases, we can't tell apart one tree ring from the next. So here we have a very pronounced tree ring border, but inside here, it's not really visible with this magnification. Different to this is the structure of a softwood. So a fir tree has very clearly visible tree rings and very prominent ring borders. Here we see one thing which is of importance for dendrochronology, which is a density zone. So usually, as I said, the first part of the tree ring consists of cells with wide lumina and not so thick walls, and outside the walls are thick. And this is why these cells appear to be darker. And here, because of some climatic change, during the ring growth, there was produced a zone of thick-walled cells, which is not to be mixed up with a real ring border. And this is a Jew tree, and again we can see a very eccentric structure of the rings. This is due to reaction wood, I will talk about later. To use features, you can use a dichotomic table. So there are yes or no decisions. Can you see big vessels on the square surface? If yes, then it is a hardwood. If not, it is a softwood. And if yes, can you see tree rings? If no, it's tropical wood. If yes, you have to decide whether the big vessels are in concentric zones or distributed all over the tree ring, and so on. And with the help of such divisions, you can find the final analysis of the tree, either species or in most cases the genus. And of course, there are other also available on the internet, other helping tools for this action. Then, of course, it's necessary to have a closer look with the help of a microscope. For this, you need to cut very thin slices. from the wood with the help of a microtome. And then they are embedded and colored. And in the end, you can see, you can look with the microscope through these very thin layers of wood, and you can see the details of the wood structure much better. So again, here we have a member of softwood, one without so-called resin ducts. Here, this is a fir tree or spruce, which has such resin ducts. Or here, this was the square surface. Here we see the tangential. Here we see the tangential layer with the rays and the so-called tracheids, which form the main tissue of the tree. And this is a radial section with the rays. Blue colored are living cells, pink colored are dead cells. And the brown things inside here are the inside of a resin duct. And in the radial section, we have other features which are necessary for dividing the several hardwood genera. So this is the cross section of a fir tree. You can see these small pits, whereas the small pits of a spruce are constructed differently. They have a different, very narrow slit. And again, completely different are the pits of a pine tree, or most of the pine trees, not all of them are grown in this way. So these are very big pits, large pits. To come to the hardwood, here we have oak, which is ring porous, which means the big vessels are at the very beginning of the tree ring, and then it starts growing small cells, and here we have the ring border. Maple is semi-diffuse porous to diffuse porous, so we have big cells at the beginning which start diminishing in diameter until they are very small in the end. And here again, other members which are also to be differentiated by the distribution of the vessels. And finally, with the help of an electron microscope, you can have an even more closer look to these structures. So this is a bordered pit, which is a connection between two cells of a softwood. And you can imagine that here penetration of liquids is not as easy as through the big holes between the vessel cells of a hardwood. Can't go to details here. And now, how basically does wood anatomy work? I take a comparison from archaeology. If you have ceramics, you can use typology, which either has a look at the clay material or the tempering, the decoration, and other features. Or you can have a look at the shape of the vessel and find several types and differentiations between these types. And in the end, you can, if you have a sequence of layers, you can attribute certain types of ceramics to certain layers, and then you find out about the distribution in time. And similar to this, the anatomical features of the three sections of an unknown sample are investigated and then are compared with features of already known woods, either with the investigation of microscopic slides or with the help of books which contain microscopic photographs. And even it's possible to go to wood collections or xylotheks which contain wood samples, and you have to produce your own slides for comparison. These are some examples for these books with microscopic photographs. And you can imagine there are thousands of different things here, and you need to have quite a good experience to find solutions here. And nowadays, it's not only a comparison of the anatomical features, but of course also the cladistics of genetics, which help to find out about the degree of close relations between several species. Here are some links to these anatomy sites. Before we have seen a square section of a Jew tree with eccentric growth. This eccentric growth comes from a tension, a tendency of the tree to have upright growth. So it always tries to grow against gravity. And if, for example, by landslide, the tree is out of balance, then it starts growing back to his upright position. And the result is this eccentric growth. In moors, you quite often can find such trees because the ground is very wet and not stable, and the tree is sinking down and again trying to grow upright. And of course, wind impact also produces very bizarre shapes of trees. And if you would cut it here, you would see a completely eccentric situation of the tree rings. Sometimes such shapes are produced intentionally because they have been used for several purposes, either in building wood structures for buildings, or, for example, in shipbuilding, or here you have the housing of a bell in a church. And again, sometimes such wood with such properties is found by chance, but sometimes, as you have seen, such structures are produced intentionally. And here we are at one of the main importances of wood for the human beings from the very beginning. Wood was always extremely important as raw material, either for firing, for construction of houses, and of course for building of tools and other machines. Here you see the distribution of the trees depending on the height of the growth area. So down there we have usually a warmer climate, and we have here a mixed forest vegetation, and step by step the hardwoods disappear, and only the softwoods are forming the trees in the upper regions. And again, another change at the Waldgrenze, the wood border, so to say, is the height of the trees. They start growing as dwarf individuals, and then somewhere the tree growth stops completely, which is the tree border. And of course, we have a similar situation if we have a look on the globe, on the Earth, because around the equator, we have a situation more or less like here, and going to the north and going to the south towards the poles. Then again, we have a change of the composition of the woods. And in the beginning, it's only hardwood. Then the softwood comes and becomes more and more prominent. And then at the Arctic region, we have only softwood, the gymnosperms, and later on towards the poles, trees disappear completely. Here we have some examples of wood decay. Wood is a material which contains a lot of substances which are a good nutrient for other living beings, from mushrooms to bacteria and insects. And you have to notice that wood is decaying not the same speed all around the tree. So here we have some hardwood, which obviously has started decaying during the lifespan of the tree. So the inside of the stem becomes hollow, and then somewhere in the tree dies, or in this situation, it was obviously cut down. Whereas the softwood, you have the hardwood portion and the bark, which is more consistent than the sapwood, and the sapwood is decaying first, and the other parts are standing longer. Here you have some examples of wood decay, some larvae of insects, and here fungi and other insects which are partly eating wood, but partly are only using it as a habitat for their houses. The fungi, or mushrooms as they're called, whereas the mushroom is the fertile piece of the fungus. So the main part of this plant is growing inside the wood and is not visible with the naked eye. You can see here very, very fine hyphae. So these are lines of cells, which are the main corpus of the fungus. And these are penetrating each of the cells and eating up the cell walls. In the end, the wood crumbles. And as wood is a decaying tissue, it is not regularly to be observed that wood is preserved. So in nature, wood always goes back to the let's say to the circle of nature. So it's eaten up and vanishes, disappears. In archaeology, we sometimes have the lucky situation that wood is preserved. So we have several types of preservation. One is the dry preservation, the wet wood preservation, the carbonification, and impregnation. And I will show you some examples of each of these situations. There was one tree which was very prominent in the vicinity of Vienna, the so-called breite Föhre, the broad fir tree. It was a landmark, and it had a serious injury at the basic of the stem, and somewhere in the tree died, and people were very unhappy of this. So they tried to stabilize the dead tree in the forest. In the end, they coated its surface with some lac, and unfortunately, this treatment supported decay, and in the end, it had to be cut down. And because of protests of the people who were fond of this, it in the end was then decided that this tree should be a prominent part of a new built museum in Lower Austria. And our institute was asked to transfer this dead tree into a museum object. And we had to remove, of course, all loose parts and again impregnate it so it is not producing dust. And then it was transferred into the museum and now forms the meeting point in the center hall. And at the basic here, you can see the injury I've mentioned. And in the at the basic of the stem, we have positioned a installation we have called time machine. So with the help of this wheel, you can move an arrow along this square surface of the tree. And here on the screen, you see it's you can see the magnified surface of this, and certain years are specially marked. And if you tap on them, then appears the historic content of the very year you are looking at. So, and this was, of course, an example for dry conservation. There are lots of other situations, especially in the alpine regions, where many buildings up till today are built of wood. So this is a small building to hold hay during winter, but also bigger farmhouses are produced entirely of wood. And some of them are quite old, and it's interesting to do dendrochronological investigations on them. And the main structure of such a building, of course, is the roof. As long as the roof is watertight, the building will survive. Another very impressive example for dry conservation is this sun bark of the pharaoh Cheops in Egypt. This bark was buried with the Cheops in a ditch just alongside the pyramid. And in the 1950s, this the ship was taken apart, and these parts have been lifted from the ditch and reconstructed inside this ship museum. Sorry. So this ship is constructed of the original wood from old Egyptian times. Again, impressive dry conservation, in this case, only because of the dry climate of Egypt. If you would have the same situation in Austria, for example, it would have decayed completely because it wouldn't have been possible to seal this ditch watertight. And of course, inside the pyramids, inside the graves in the Valley of Kings, there are watertight situations, and woods from several thousand years age have survived until today like new. Let's switch to wetwood conservation. Wetwood conservation means wood has been conserved from decay by coverage of water. Here we have the bottom of a galleon at the shore of Great Britain, the South Shore. And you see here the bottom of the ship. The position is very unfavorable because at ebb tide it is out of water, and high tide the water covers it, but it's always wet. And of course the strength of the waves it has heavy impact on these wood remains. They disappear from year to year. And here you see a sketch of this accident. This Spanish galleon was conquered by a British pirate, which was pardoned by the Queen. And the ship was intended to be brought to London. And in the channel, a storm came up and the ship was driven ashore. And it broke apart. You see here lots of people either salvaging the sailors, but also, of course, salvaging the goods which have been transported on the ship. And even today, you can see parts of farmhouses or furniture made of the wood of this and other ships. An Austrian example is this log boat from medieval times. We saved it from the bottom of Wörthersee in Carinthia. It was not included into the ground layers of this lake, but it was laying directly on the surface of the bottom. So it was also in danger of being destroyed. And you can see only a small part at the back part of the ship is missing, and everything else is in complete shape as it was built. It is made of oak. And here you can see this is part of the original tree, and here again, which helps to stabilize the property of the ship body. If you have dry wood, the only thing you need to take in mind is to keep it dry. If you have wet wood, you need to keep it wet. If you let a wet wood piece dry out, it will shrink and split and will be of completely other proportions than it originally has been. So this log boat has to be stored in water to wait for conservation. There are several possibilities to conserve such a wooden piece, and afterwards it can be dried and, for example, exhibited in a museum. But before conservation, it is definitely necessary to keep it wet. There is another log boat which also was lying on the surface of the ground. So there is a lot of erosion in Austrian lakes, which bring such artifacts to light. You can see the wood has been cracked already, and we also salvaged it, and I do hope it will be conserved soon and on exposition in a museum. Another most important and most prominent site type is the Peliphites. These are settlements around the Alps, mostly in the water or at the shore of a lake. Very few of them are built on islands in the middle of a lake. So there are only 2-3 such settlements known. All others are at the wet areas of shores. And we were investigating the site of Koitschach in Carinthia. And you can see bigger pieces of wood, which obviously have been construction woods before, and then the piles, which were driven into the ground and in former days have supported huts or other buildings. Well, wet wood, I would like to switch back. Wet wood is usually found in the water of lakes and rivers, where it was deposited not intentionally. There are only very rare situations. For example, some log boats might have been intentionally put to the ground of a lake, most cases, because in the dry it would also shrink and split, and then of course it wouldn't be useful as a boat any longer. But for example, Keutschach was definitely destroyed by a fire in the first place, and some other impact we don't know, and it was left by the inhabitants, and the huts crumbled and the wood fell into the lake and is preserved there till today. So in the contrary to, or it is not, let's say it is similar with the charcoal. The charcoal we can buy in the shops today are of course produced intentionally with technical devices. The original way of producing charcoal was the charcoal stack, where a big amount of wood was piled, and then whether this type or this type of stack, it was covered with peat and earth, and then it was lighted, but it of course was not allowed to burn, but only to have a very small fire inside, which changes the wood structure to charcoal and not to ash, which is usually the result in an open fire. So most of the, or almost every charcoal finding in archaeological connects is produced not intentionally, but by chance. Whether it be a big fireplace or a building which was burning down and collapsed, inside there most often there were zones with a lack of oxygen, and there the wood didn't burn to ash but changed to charcoal. Here you have charcoal pieces of construction wood. This one from an Lebanese Tel site, and this one from a Syrian palace. And you can see clearly the situation of the tree rings, and even you can see the change in ring width. So there is always a change of wide rings and narrow rings, widening rings, narrow rings, wide rings, narrow rings. We right now are not sure what's the reason for this volatility. It might be climatic impacts, it might be some insects injuring the tree for a certain time and then dying away and then coming back. We have to investigate it on. Charcoals are not only be investigated with the help of lens or microscope, but even with an electron microscope. And here we can see clearly the wood species and also the degree of degradation, because sometimes wood is first exposed to, let's say, to nature, and later on as a firewood is then used, and this of course shows necessarily a certain degree of degradation. So here we have examples of charcoal from a Paleolithic site. This is from the time it is before the maximum of the last glaciation. And you can see the rings are extremely narrow. This one is 3 cells wide. And the tree was definitely on the edge of survival. And to use dendrochronology with such samples, it's necessary to use the electron microscope, of course. And also for species analysis of charcoal, it can be done with the microscope, but to produce satisfying pictures for publication, it's better to use the electron microscope. And finally, we have the impregnation. The impregnation might be salt. It might be corrosion products, which are, of course, also salts, but different to the salt we use at the table. And such salts usually are water soluble, and by this they may be transported into the wood, and there they keep wood from decaying. One of the most prominent sites in Austria is Hallstatt, where a salt mine of the Hallstatt period, the Iron Age, was found by modern salt exploiting, and this ancient salt mining was not done as today with a solution by the help of water, but the salt was cut out of the mines and transported with such bags to the surface. And all these 3 examples, the staircase, the very famous one, this shoe and this transport bag, are from the Hallstatt period. And you can see they are really preserved in pristine condition. You could use them even today for the same purpose. There are other situations where wood can be preserved in close connection with metal objects. So, for example, this Alemannic X has produced iron oxide, which was transported into the wood and therefore preserved this part of the shaft of this X. And here this sword has a, I missed the word, I'm sorry. This coverage of the sword, which is inside, and this coverage is outside, covered with a very thin gold layer, and inside it is wood, and this wood is still preserved from Carolingian times because the blade of the sword started producing oxygen, and this penetrated the wood and preserved it. So this way of preservation is either found in salt mines or in connection with graves. So it is necessary to be under wet conditions so the salt can be transported, and it has to be under, of course, under wet conditions which are not, which are stable and not have any mechanical impact, because this way of preservation sometimes is not very mechanically stable. Now let's have a look at where wood analysis can be used for. One thing is wood species analysis. As I have shown before, these Paleolithic sites, here we have Krems-Wachtberg, before it was Krems-Hundsteig, they show lots of tiny charcoal samples. So they have a maximum diameter of maybe 15 millimeters, but with a proper magnification, they show a clear picture of these very, very narrow rings. We have in the first place tried to stabilize the charcoal with the help of an artificial resin, and then to cut it with the microtome into thin slides. But of course, this is a tremendously time-consuming operation, and it doesn't give perfect results. It doesn't always give perfect results. So we switched to the electron microscope, which is much easier to be used. And here you can see the square surface of a pine tree. So again, you have the resin duct. Here you have the tangential section of a pine tree. The resin ducts are not only axial, parallel to the stem, but also radial inside the rays. And here you have the radial section with these big pits in the cross-field section, which is the overlay of a ray and the Chariots. And you can see it's a very high magnification. And again, here, most of the wood remains are from pine, but very rarely there are also larch or spruce. And from the composition of the wood species, you can deduct that the wood of these times, 28,000 pp, was mainly consisting of fir trees. So, and this is consistent with the idea that at that time, the hardwoods have almost completely disappeared from our region because glaciation was coming, and of course the climate change dependent. And also you can make investigations on the difference of certain trees. Of course, we have investigated some 2,000 samples, and it was not possible to do wood species analysis with each of the samples in detail. So sometimes we had to rely on features which were visible on the square surface. We also used for dendrochronology. And here you can watch a decrease in diameter of the cells, but the cell walls, the thickness of the cell walls stays almost stable, which is typical for Pinus cembra. Whereas the silver fir has a prominent increase of wall thickness during the outer part of the cells in the tree ring. A second thing we can have a look at is the evolution of the Neolithic wheel and the Bronze Age war chariot. And of course, these studies are only possible because at least parts of such machines were preserved and found by archaeologists. Here you have some differences between the first wheels. Both of them are made of planks of wood, which have been fixed together by small pieces of wood. Again here, the big difference between the northern type and the southern type is, or let's say the eastern and the western type, is you can see here that the axle has a round hole, whereas here the axle has a square hole. The round hole means the axle was not rotating, only the wheel rotated around the axle. The square hole means the axle had to rotate with the wheel. And depending on these different structures, the whole structure of the chariot was different. So here you can see some graphic representations of different construction details. The Sumeric chariot had disc wheels, as we have seen them from Neolithic times, whereas the Egyptian chariot already had spoke wheels, which of course were, first of all, not as heavy as the disc wheels, and they were much more stable. So they didn't break as easy as the disc wheels. And this was of big advantage for the users of this type of chariot. We have several of such chariots preserved in Egyptian graves. So there are at least 8 of such chariots preserved. Here you see one example from the museum at Firenze. It is a very efficient construction with a small platform where the warrior, who also had to irrigate the horses, was standing to stabilize his position. He had some handhold and the axle with the wheels, and then the wood to fix the horses to the chariot. And this chariot was, there was done wood species analysis. If you have a look to the literature, it's quite different. So different investigations produce different species, which is in this case not surprising, because of course it was not allowed to cut off parts of the wood of this chariot. So it has to be done only with a magnifying lens. And then it might be maybe difficult to find out about whether it was this or that wood species. But what you can see here is that certain types of wood are very suitable for certain parts of the chariot. So, for example, willow for the piece of wood which connects the horses to the chariot is very has very good properties, because it is elastic, it doesn't break easily, and you can pull it without damage. On the other hand, the axle is made of maybe ash or maybe oak. Both would be very hardwood, and would be very suitable for this purpose. And again, the bent part of the wheel were made of ash, which can be bent easily if you think of the tonnet furniture. Whereas the spokes were made of plum or maybe also oak, and both are very stable and strong against pressure. So this wheel was produced of certain types of wood, especially selected for the mechanical impact the certain part has to withstand. And this, of course, gives us an insight into the ability of those people using certain wood properties for certain usage. Here we have again remains of a Thracic chariot from a tumulus grave in Bulgaria. And again, here certain parts of the wooden part of the chariot are preserved due to impregnation by metal oxides. And from this archaeological situation, you can, of course, produce an overview of how this type of chariot spread into Europe and also into Asia. And you can see a center in the southern part of Ural. And here we have three main distribution directions: to the east, to the south, and to the west. So this is the archaeological situation. And this is a bit in contrast to another way of investigating this problem, which is the DNA investigation of horse remains from several archaeological excavations. And here colleagues found that the beginnings of horse domestication, which of course is precondition for using a chariot, was in the 4th millennium BC in the Caucasus. So it's not far apart from southern Ural, but it is a bit a different area, and it is of course much earlier. So in the beginning, most probably horses have been used for riding in the plains of the eastern steppe, and later on, with the invention of the chariot, were used in other parts of Europe and Asia. So this is a very interesting connection between two different approaches to a topic, and of course they support or help each other to find out about the real situation as it was millennia before. I hope I was able to give you some insight into how to use wood, how to find wood samples for such investigations, and how to deal with them. In the end, I should maybe add that dry wood has to stay dry, wet wood has to stay wet, and charcoal has to be packed very carefully to avoid mechanical impact, as it is easily crumbled and then of course of no further use. So if you find such wood, it is recommended to bring it to lab as soon as possible, because wet wood can mold, for example, and charcoal can crumble. And the bigger the pieces the lab is able to investigate, the better it is, and the more interesting the results can be, which can be achieved. I would be happy if you have any questions to answer them.